All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this Perry World House Rapid Response panel examining the Israel-Iran conflict and its implication for regional stability and international security. My name is Farah Jan. I'm a senior lecturer in the International Relations program here at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'll be moderating today's very important discussion. So we gather today as a military conflict unfolds in real time between Israel and Iran, with casualties already reported on both sides. We recognize that behind every strategic assessment and policy analysis are real human lives being affected, civilians, families, and communities across the region experiencing profound uncertainty and loss at the moment. As scholars and policy practitioners, we have a responsibility to bring analytical clarity to these events while remaining deeply mindful of their human dimension. We acknowledge that many in our audience may have personal connections to the region and are watching these events with particular concern. I myself have friends whose families are in Iran and are deeply concerned about the situation. Now, with that, our purpose today is not to advocate for any particular position or outcome, but rather provide a rigorous evidence-based analysis that helps us all better understand the complex dynamics at play. Our distinguished panel today brings expertise in Iranian politics, Israeli security policy, regional diplomacy, and US foreign policy. With that framework in mind, let me introduce our panelists and ask each to provide a brief opening thoughts on where we find ourselves. First, we have Marie Harf, who's the Executive Director of Perry World House and a former State Department spokesperson, played a key role in the 2015 Iran nuclear negotiations under the Obama administration. With Hussein Benai, visiting fellow at Perry World House and associate professor at Indiana University, specializing in US-Iran relations. We have Arash Azizi, who's a senior lecturer at Yale University and contributing writer to The Atlantic, bringing deep expertise on Iranian politics and society. And finally, Ilan Goldenberg, who's a senior vice president and chief policy officer at J Street with extensive experience in the Middle East and Middle East security policy. So I'd say let's begin with Arash Azizi. Arash, you've been reporting from inside Iran, speaking with activists throughout this crisis. Please share your opening perspective.
Thank you very much. I thought a lot about how, what would be the good way to open this. And I thought, yes, in the spirit of all the people I've spoken to, and, you sort of have especially now that the communication in Iran are cut, you sort of almost feel a duty to like tell their stories. I'll try to share some perspective from inside Iran. And of course, Iran is a politically diverse country, like any country, but even more than usual, I would say it's a very politically divided times for Iranians. So there's not one reaction that I've seen in the past couple of days or past couple of, since the war began on last Friday. We're unbelievably starting a second week already. I would say a couple of perspectives that I think are important. When conversations in DC and United States about the war and its political consequences in Iran tend to be divided between, it's either that Iranians are cheering on the bombs and just waiting to be liberated by Israel and the war, or that they're rallying around the flag and they forgot all their differences and they say, now, Mr. Khamenei, I'll defend you now that the war is going on. And I think, and I mean, I'm exaggerating for sort of for good effect a little here, but not that much, right? These are sort of the two polls that we are given. I think it's speaking to Iranians across sort of political spectrum. I've seen that it's neither is true. And two very common sentiments that I think I would say exist across a very wide range of a spectrum. Not everybody, but across a very wide range of a spectrum. First, is an anger at war, of course, wanting it to end, and not anger at war in sort of a abstract way, wanting it to end, which is it's kind of, I mean, it's not that surprising because if you live in Tehran and you see bombs all around you, maybe at the first night you are thinking of the political consequences of this and whether you are hopeful or not. But at some point you want to stay alive, like the rest of us. And tons of Iranians have had to leave Tehran. They've had to horrifically see the kind of civilian casualties that war brings, the sort of war-like feelings that they hadn't seen for a very long time, since the Iran-Iraq war. So they want the war to end. And you speak to people, say, please, tell the world we want the war to end. We don't want this war. So that certainly doesn't chime in with. And I'm talking a lot of anti-regime activists. I did this article for The Atlantic when I spoke to so many people. I almost wanted to get a different perspective in there as well, but I called like 12 people and they all said the same thing. So at some point you're like, it's not balanced if I just invent a different position. This is what a wide range of activists think. And the second point I would say though, is that they blame the conditions that we are in very much on Ayatollah Khamenei and his policies. I don't see a rally around the flag, and I see a rally around the people, as I said. People are helping each other in incredibly touching ways. They understand that they're in this together. The political divisions don't matter when you're trying to, who doesn't have petrol, who doesn't have bread, who can you help someone's, medicine in there, who hasn't spoken to their mom. You have a way of getting to them and connecting them. But I think a lot of people sort of blame it on Ayatollah Khamenei and his policies, and not just as a sort of generic blame game, but that the demand they have out of this in many ways is a peace demand. It is not a war demand, i.e., the average reaction is not, and the two actually make sense together when you think about it. They want war to end, and they want Iran to agree to something. They want this long path of anti-Israel, anti-Western hostility to somehow end. And I mean, it's quite clear, of course, Iranians, I think vast majority of Iranians are not a big fan of the Islamic Republic and they want it to go. But on even a sort of a more almost pragmatic level now, people are like, we need to move on, and moving on means, Khamenei needs to go, or there needs to be some leadership change. So I think I'll stop here, for the opening times. I don't want to go on for too long, but I would say that, yeah, so this sort of, it's a false dichotomy that, you either support the regime or support the war. And I think they very, and let me also just say this, that to back up my word, so it's not just me talking to my secret, sources. I mean, if you look at the political positions of people like Mustafa Tajzadeh, former deputy interior minister, sort of political prisoner. If you look at Faiz Hashemi, if you look at these are people from, inside the regime who are critical, but also then outside, you look at Nargis Mohammadi, Shir Nabadi, Nobel Peace Laureate, Jafar Panahi, filmmaker in Iran. As you know, filmmakers are political figures, so it really matters what they say. Their positions are all the same, despite the sort of differences. Their position is, give it up. The jig is up. Stop the enrichment is what Ebadi and them said. Tajzadeh and them didn't stop mention that particularly, but they're basically asking for a ceasefire and it's sort of a political transition. Again, on pragmatic grounds, not because just the regime is bad or don't like a dictatorship, but that we need to get over this period. So that is the important demand coming on. Whether it's realistic or what are the actual political consequences of the war, I'm happy to maybe discuss in next rounds.
Thanks, Arash. Now let's hear from Hussein Benai. Hussein's written extensively on US-Iran relations. Has, what are your thoughts on the current situation?
Yeah. Well, thank you for organizing this panel, to Perry Worldhouse, and thank you for moderating. So my initial comments, I think Arash has done a good job of giving you the context around the kind of Iran side of this. I think there are two contexts. There's an international and regional context through which one could look at this particular conflict. But the key question that I think merges both of those contexts is the question of why now? When the war broke out, there were all these clips of Benjamin Netanyahu going back to 1998 that people were circulating on social media, saying Iran is, 2 years, 2 months, a week away from acquiring a bomb that he's been saying for, more than 25 years now. So the question of why this particular prime minister, who's been very alarmist about Iran's nuclear program, has chosen to act at this time is an important one to examine. And I think here, I think a big international context to consider here is the context of the total abdication of great power responsibility on the part of the United States that served as a kind of a check on the impulses of someone like Benjamin Netanyahu for so long, bipartisan, both Republican and Democratic administrations who were very effective at signaling that they would not tolerate such an action. I think we're looking at the most significant interstate conflict of the post-rules-based order that the United States was a vanguard of since 1945. I think we're seeing what happens when the policy process inside the United States is completely hollowed out, and that security dilemmas created for American allies and adversaries force them to such a position where they have to immediately act on their worst fears. And I think that's why I broke out in this context. I was worried about this since the inauguration or since election, that Netanyahu would have to act on this window because he finally has a president who does not have those traditional restraints on him, and that he also sees Iran as its most vulnerable. So the regional context of the why is that all the kind of traditional, if you will, buffers between Iran and Israel, Iran's proxies in the region, have now been removed. Israel has very effectively decapitated, removed Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Obviously, the war in Gaza has completely all but eliminated Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. These are proxies, and the Houthis in Yemen also, and the removal of Bashar al-Assad. I mean, these are all if you will, the chess pieces that the Islamic Republic had to call on to deter Israel from taking such an action. And they've all been removed in the most spectacular fashion in the last 9 months. I mean, we have the spectacle of a war. I remember for the longest time, people would say that if the war breaks out, Israeli citizens are going to be bombarded from the north by Hezbollah rockets. And not a single one has been shot. And it tells you how effective Israel has been at neutralizing those proxies, which now brings it in direct confrontation with Iran. So a combination of regional structural and international structural changes, I think, explain the why now when I look at this conflict. That goes really beyond the specific, I think, day-to-day intelligence and military aspects of this. And I'll leave it that angle over there, and perhaps we can return to that and other dimensions.
Thank you, Huss. Next, I'd like to go to Ilan Goldenberg. Ilan, you bring in deep expertise in Middle East security policy. So what are your thoughts?
Sure. Thank you, Farah. And maybe I'll start by just building on a couple of things Hussein said, because I worked at the Pentagon from 2009 to 2012 on the Iran desk at a time where it was probably the closest we got to an Israel-Iran war before the last few weeks. And our strategy throughout that time period, the same strategy was employed actually before that by George Bush with Ehud Olmert, and afterwards also by Joe Biden, was this combination of embrace the Israelis and demonstrate to them that, like, we can actually do this much better than you can. So don't, and simultaneously be 100% clear about the fact that we don't want them to do this, and that, if it's necessary, like, then you can move away from diplomacy towards this. And I think what you saw with Trump was kind of the opposite of that over the past few months. I mean, he did actually have, I think, the right instincts in trying to go for a deal in a moment where, there was opportunity and leverage, but he did it without reassuring the Israelis at all, kind of went off on his own. There was a lot of anxiety in Jerusalem about what he was up to. And simultaneously, when Netanyahu came to him and said, I think I'm going to do this, rather than throwing up the big, strong red light that Netanyahu has previously gotten, I don't think he got a full green, but he got this flashing yellow. And the real problem with it is, and I'm trying to spend most of my time as a former American policymaker on the U.S. position on this and angle, is that Israel went in without a plan for what to do about Fordo, one of Iran's most significant nuclear facilities. And what appears to be, unless the Israelis have some kind of magical sort of card up their sleeves, and they can be very creative operationally, but the longer this goes, the less likely that seems, is that the plan for Fordo is for the U.S. to come in afterwards and have no choice but to take it out. And so if you're the American president and his advisors, how you hadn't thought about this possibility, and the fact that by saying yes or even blinking yellow, you were potentially saying yes to yourself going in, pretty, I think goes to exactly what Hussein talked about of what happens when you hollow out the national security bureaucracy in the United States, get rid of expertise and people who've been dealing with this problem for years and replace it with what we have instead. In terms of the good news, I would say is we are at a very important and interesting moment, right? The president, like we could have been looking at a American direct involvement in the war in the last 24 to 48 hours. That does not seem to have happened. The president has come out and said we now have 2 weeks for negotiations. Now, you never know with Trump. 2 weeks could mean 3 months. 2 weeks could mean tomorrow. But at least for the moment, it appears as though wants to give diplomacy a chance. And what I want to do with a couple minutes is just talk about kind of what the diplomatic option looks like versus what the American military intervention option looks like, right? And the risks associated with it. The diplomatic option is trying to go back to basically where we were before all this started. There was an American offer on the table that the Iranians were going to counter on. It involved, limited enrichment in Iran over time, some kind of international consortium for the Gulf that would eventually mean zero enrichment inside of Iran, but a consortium that could allow Iran to get its nuclear sort of civilian fuel, through other means. That offer, I would still encourage the Iranian government and leadership to take that offer. I'm skeptical that they will, but I think that's a starting point for a negotiation. It still has the potential to really put Iran's nuclear program in a box. Frankly, I'd be fine with something along the lines of the JCPOA, the Obama's nuclear deal 10 years ago, that was less than this. The Marie worked on very significantly. But something like that. That's one option. Try to still get there, even though it's very hard in this environment. The alternative is American military strikes on Fordo. And look, there is a world where the U.S. does these very limited strikes and Iran is in a very weak position. The U.S. messages, this is it for us. There's a limited Iranian retaliation. Things can be managed. And you eventually get to de-escalation between Israel and Iran. Iran is dramatically set back. Maybe you can still get to some kind of a deal. And it kind of turns out the way it did for Hezbollah, very badly for Iran and very good for Israel and the United States. However, there's also a lot of risk in this. Iran is a much more capable entity than Hezbollah. You could have missile strikes on American bases in the Gulf or in Iraq. You could have efforts to try to, mine the Strait of Hormuz. I think some of these, I think you potentially can get through that. I'm not sure the Iranian government wants to go there, but then in the long term, you're going to have, in my mind, the most likely scenario, and obviously I'd love to hear, especially, from others on this, especially those who understand internal Iranian dynamics better than I do. I don't think you're going towards regime change. I think you're much more likely to go towards like the world, something that looks a little bit like Saddam Hussein's Iraq of the 1990s, where the regime is wounded, still in place, much more aggressive, much less risk averse, certainly trying to pursue a nuclear weapon very aggressively. Can you stop it in that scenario? I don't know, but all the sort of previous restraints are off. Certainly you could have prolonged conflict between Israel and Iran where missiles are flying into Israel every day, and maybe it's going to be worse in Iran and it's going to be worse for civilians in Iran than it will be for Israel. But, people I talk to in Israel right now are spending, a friend of mine described it kind of like being in COVID again. Like you're home all day, you have nowhere to go, constantly going into shelters, up half the night. 1 weekend, the Israeli public believes this is the right thing to do, and there is a rally around the flag effect in Israel with 90%. But if this is where we are in a month or two, like that's not really going to be very sustainable for the Israeli public. So there's just a lot of things and just sort of unknowns and risks if you go down the pathway of an American strike and direct military intervention versus if you can still get to a diplomatic deal that puts Iran's nuclear program in some kind of box and de-escalates all of this. And so I think the president was right to say 2 weeks or longer and to not just prematurely go in. And now let's take some time to actually think about step 2, 3, 4, and 5, because as we've learned from, Gaza, as we've learned from Iraq, as we've learned from Afghanistan, we really do poorly and do ourselves a disservice when we don't think about step 2, 3, 4, and 5 before jumping in head first.
Thanks, Elon. Finally, Marie, your thoughts? You were deeply involved in the 2015 nuclear negotiations. What do you think of the current situation?
Thank you. And I think there's a lot that's been put on the table already that we can, and there's questions coming in, so we'll get to all of those as well. But to set the stage a little bit, Elon, I'm curious whether it was a blinking yellow. I really do not think President Trump wanted Israel to do this at this moment. I think that he was deeply committed to the diplomatic route. He wants a big diplomatic win. He hasn't had his Ukraine-Russia win. This is why he negotiated with the North Koreans in the first term. I think that he is much more intrigued by having a statesman-like win at the negotiating table than dropping some bombs. That's my instinct about Trump. I do not think he will strike Fordo. I think that the 2 weeks took the pressure lever off, and now we are sliding into some sort of stalemate diplomatic path that I'm happy to talk about a little bit more. He also doesn't like to be cornered. And I think that despite all of the talk about how close the US and Israel are, I think that the fact that President Trump on his first overseas trip went to the Gulf and did not go to Israel, I think that was not lost on the Israelis, certainly. I think there were very real reasons that Trump did not, that it showed where his priorities were. And I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu absolutely, to what Alon said, believed that he would start the war and bank on the US coming in to hit Fordo. I want to also take a moment as someone who deeply believes in Israel's security and believes that there are real security threats in the region to Israel that they need to continue going after. Not just the extraordinary Israeli military success against Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran itself, but this has been decades, an intelligence case, decades in the making, where Israel was able to infiltrate into Iran, build, a small drone base in Iran that was able the first night, second night of the conflict to take out so much of Iran's military infrastructure. This was not just a military success. And I think the success that Israel has shown at penetrating the Iranian government, the Iranian military establishment, and taking out proxies laid the groundwork for where we are today. And we should not, I think, overlook that in terms of what that means going forward. Just a couple more points. So first, as someone who publicly argued for years that diplomacy is the best way to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, I still believe that, or best and most durable, I should say. But I am spending a lot of time in this conflict, especially if we strike Fordo. This might work. The course of action that I and others argued publicly and believed deeply for decades, for years, that the most durable, lasting way to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon was through diplomacy. If the US takes out Fordo, if Iran is not able, they don't have the money, the resources, the talent to rebuild, from a very narrow goal of preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, this could work. And one of the challenges I've thought a lot about as someone who thinks about narrative and how we talk publicly about these things, in Trump's first term, a lot of us who didn't agree with his policies on Iran, every time he would do something, I would say the sky is falling. He assassinated Qasem Soleimani. I said, oh, there's going to be this backlash in the region. And yes, Iran did attack American interests and assets in the region, but it didn't start World War III, right? It didn't start a wider regional conflict that the US was drawn into. So I still believe in sort of the diplomatic effort. I still believe that's what is most likely to happen here. But we should note that there is the possibility that Israel will succeed at destroying Iran's nuclear program if we help, if and only if we help, I think, on the basis of basically a 2-year campaign to militarily degrade Iran's sort of nuclear and security establishment. And that is an interesting lesson for me as I think about other places in the world going forward. The second thing I would say is I am not an expert on the internal Iranian political system, but it is interesting to me that I also think they did not believe Israel would strike. And the question about whether it's worth it, decades of sanctions, now military action, to enrich up to a certain percent but never go further, like, was all of this worth it for the Iranian regime? I don't know how they would answer that question today, but they never, according to every intelligence assessment I've ever heard, were actually racing for a bomb. They may now, right? If they have more incentive now to. They were trying to remain in this threshold state where they could do it if they had to, but it turns out that was a huge miscalculation and gamble, that they just brought a ton of pain on themselves and their people, and now this is where it's ended up. So I think that's just one interesting part of this, that for a long time, people thought that Iran had more leverage because they had so much enriched uranium and so much know-how. I don't know that that's the case. And then the last thing I would say is, I guess there's two final things very quickly I will say. The first is the American political conversation around this. On the right, there is this, and I think this is part of what led to the 2-week delay by President Trump. There is an intense debate among Republicans that are more hawkish and those that are more isolationist about whether they should go take military action in Iran. And I think that deeply impacts the president and his team. I also think that impacts Congress. And I don't believe that we will actually get a real war powers act coming, vote coming out of Congress to actually give congressional authority to do this if Trump decides to. I think they should. I think that's what the law requires. I think that's what is the right thing to do. But there are a lot of splits in the American political system right now, particularly on the right, about another military engagement in the Middle East. And that is a key part driving the administration's response here. I think that's part of why you saw this 2-week pullback. And then the last thing I would say is that I also see this as someone who spent a lot of time in Israel and negotiating with the Israelis, as Ilan has as well. I have to see this in the context of the larger sort of moment in Israel and the U.S.-Israel relationship. You have an ambassador to the U.S. and Israel who is a very publicly avowed Christian Zionist who believes we should annex the West Bank. Israel is certainly taking steps to move towards that. They've continued their campaign in Gaza. They've eliminated much of the threat from Hezbollah. Now they're eliminating the threat from Iran in many respects. Prime Minister Netanyahu, who everyone says politically people don't like him, he's controversial, he's doing all these things domestically that people really don't like. This is part of the concerted campaign by him and his very conservative coalition to project Israeli power, to expand it. They've moved into parts of Syria that they had wanted for a long time because of the power vacuum there. This is part of the Netanyahu broader strategy to push Israeli, I think, power and territory further out. And I can't see what they're doing in Iran divorced from sort of this moment we're in Israeli politics and in the U.S.-Israel relationship.
Thanks, Marie. So I want to go back to the point you raised, that we all thought diplomacy is the way to go, but there's a potential of this actually working if the US bombs Fordo. What about norms that we are setting? Normalizing attacking nuclear facilities. Down the road, we're kind of paving the way for China to take certain steps like that. My question to all of you is, are we kind of seeing the collapse of the entire nuclear proliferation framework that's held since 1968?
Who wants to take that? Us or Ilan?
Can I just maybe I'll hop in on and react to partially that, and also Marie's assessment on
Yeah.
it could work. I mean, I agree actually that it could work. I mean, I think we need to be, and I think Marie would actually agree with me though. I think what I try to say is there's all the risks on one side, right, of a military strike. And then on the other side, there's using diplomacy to actually get to that sustainable deal. And so I actually think that this could absolutely end up working, but it might also end up being incredibly costly. And even if it works to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon for at least a few years, creating all kinds of unintended consequences that we're going to be wrapping our heads around for the next 25 years, including like I would put, the possibility of what it does to the global proliferation regime, like into that category. That's not something we're going to be able to tell tomorrow, right? But so you have to weigh that against the idea of doing a deal that could get you 90% of what you would get otherwise. And so that's where I come down on the side of the deal, like, and still think, even though probably the likelihood of actually getting to a diplomatic deal has now gone down pretty significantly, it's still worth trying to that instead of opening up that Pandora's box of a direct American intervention. And like that deal still tries to keep in place precisely that non-proliferation regime that's existed. And so that's kind of how at least I look at this right now. Even if I should say, like, the early Israeli military operations have been incredibly impressive. And my experience with the Israelis is they are very, very good operationally, but that does not always translate into long-term strategy. As we're seeing in Gaza, where, despite the fact that they have largely taken out Hamas's ability to reconstitute and do something like October 7th again, but here we are like a year and a half in, and I think Israel is calling reservists up for a third and fourth time. 70% of the population in Israel wants to see the war end in exchange for the hostages. Israel is losing a lot internationally, is losing a lot of support in the United States, things that really matter for Israel's long-term positioning in the world and power, because they won't like try to go down a pathway of what does like an actual sustainable end state in Gaza look like.
Can I jump in on this? I think so I think first of all, to your question about norms, I think there is a precedent for what Israel's doing, and Israel's the only country who's done it, which is it has killed off the nuclear aspirations, and not at this level, of both Iraq and Syria, who had undertaken thinking about building nuclear weapons in the past. And obviously, the case of Iran is very different. You have a much more developed nuclear program spread around the country. Part of the discussion about American involvement has to do with the fact that there are limits to what Israel can do to effectively wipe out Iran's nuclear program. So at the level of norms, I think there's a kind of an Israel exception here that I don't see it kind of spreading to other countries or other parts of the world. To the question of whether a strike on Fordow would end Iran's nuclear program, I think there's a question of willpower and material power when it comes to when you're facing a decimated set of military assets, let's say, include them as military assets. At the material power level, people have to remember that this program has been built brick by brick over the course of 30 plus years. Money's very tight in Iran. The material resources it would require to rebuild and redirect from a very broken economy into this is going to take Iran some time. So we're not going to see Iran's program get revived, immediately next year. You're not playing whack-a-mole. And Israeli strikes in this, for this reason, I think play a very important strategic part for Israel's purposes in the short term. It'll buy the Israelis and set back Iran's nuclear aspirations for some time, especially if they hit enrichment and heavy water reactor sites. The question of willpower is a long-term question, because it's a question of whether the Iranians will dedicate themselves to rebuilding this program over time again. And we'll be here, 5 years, 10 years, 20, 25, 30 years again. And whether ultimately a nuclear agreement could solve this. This is why I think Israel is upping the ante on leadership strikes and talking about regime change. Saw a question by the audience about regime change around this. I think Benjamin Netanyahu would very much like to seize this opportunity to once and for all get rid of the Islamic Republic, or the version of it that's in power right now. And part of the hesitation on the part of the Trump administration is that they are not interested, indifferent, maybe even to the question of regime change, and that the kind of intricacies that you would have to invest in to bring about effective regime change is one that this administration is not even remotely interested in. And one could argue that in the context of domestic politics, to what Marie said, they are much more interested in consolidating and building on the regime change at home that they're undertaking in the United States, reshaping the federal government, the purpose of American power abroad, rethinking alliances, all of those things. Washington is undertaking under Trump a kind of regime change at home right now. So they're much more interested in that. And I think the discussion between the kind of the Tucker Carlson, the Bannon wing versus the kind of more, if you will, neoconservative wing here of the Trump administration, I think highlights that they would like him to focus on the regime change at home, not abroad. And so I think for that reason, I see Iran as the ultimate loser. I mean, either way, their program is either just has already gotten delayed, and they're going to have to really divert tremendous resources to rebuild it back to this point.
Thanks, Sas. I want to go to some of the questions that we're getting from the audience. One of the question is, I think you refer to it, regime. Countries. That kind of touches on the regional picture, particularly if Israel's moving towards regime change in Iran. I want to add to this, Saudi Arabia's condemned the strikes. Hezbollah is staying quiet. It's weakened, and the Gulf states are worried about becoming targets if the conflict expands. So what sort of a response are we expecting from the region? Arash, you want to take a stab at that, or Marie?
Sorry, Marie, you were gonna. Sorry, I just missed you for a second there. I just missed half of your question because due to the connection.
The question is, what do you think will be the response from the Arab states? I added to the question saying Saudi Arabia has condemned the strikes. Hezbollah is staying quiet because they have been weakened the last year. And the other Gulf states, the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, they're all worried about becoming targets if the conflict expands.
Yeah, so this is, I'm happy to answer this because I do actually believe that a very big part of the question are the GCC countries, and I think that's sometimes missed. So let me just say a couple of things. First of all, I think Iran's main hesitation in wanting to fight America, basically, and take the war to America would have to do with GCC countries. Because if Iran has done one thing right from its own perspective the last 5 years, is that it's rebuilt painstakingly these ties with GCC states. And it's kind of funny, actually. I talked to some of this regime officials and sort of sources. They also speak some so glowingly of like Saudi Arabia, the Iran's ties with them, that I kind of chuckle because I remember a time where these guys were all, the Al Saud was like the ultimate evil they talked about.
Yeah.
All of that is gone. There's a zero. So I think that's a very important question. Also, as you know, there was a Saudi military delegation in Iran. It almost gets, frankly, at some level, it almost gets me to semi-conspiratorial visions there, because it's clear that there's some Saudi-Iranian relationship that helps determine the outlooks of part of the Iranian security establishment. I.e. that, they've had these talks with Saudis. They have some sort of a shared vision for the future. So I think, that really colors how they think about the Saudis. And as for the GCC themselves, I think, saying nothing special here, but, the general tendency of not wanting tension in the region and being very worried about the war. And they, of course, they condemn the attacks, but that's just public. But even privately not wanting the war is there. At the same time, I was talking to some of the officials. They're like, well, all this is true, but, we haven't really become like the fan of Islamic Republic overnight either. So, everybody gets excited a little bit thinking about the world beyond the Islamic Republic, frankly, because of all the wonderful experiences they've had within the 40-something years ago. So I think that conditions the way and they'll talk about it, they'll think about it. Ultimately, I'm a bit of a, sort of a broken record on here, but even before the war, I thought a very possible prognosis, which I think is sort of desirable in some ways and also very possible, is sort of an internal change in the regime and coming to power of certain factions that are, and I've written this and I've sort of held this perspective for a while, that certain factions that want to do away with the anti-Western and hostility and make Iran a more normal state, and the Arab states I think become key in that equation, because part of that whole thing is Iran becomes a bit more like its neighbors, authoritarian, but also integrated into the Western economy. And I think that really shapes how these guys think about each other, and it's not just thinking about each other, but it's talking to each other. I think it's important to appreciate, as I said, how much conversations now goes on between Iran and GCC countries and other Arab countries like Egypt and others.
Thanks, Arash. I do want to go. I'm getting a few questions, and I do want to address most of these. Going back to Trump's ultimatum and this 2-week deadline that we have, one of the audience question is, will Israel accept any agreement Trump may negotiate or will take actions no matter what, since they don't trust that any agreement will be true or lasting, or want to rely on anyone else for this safety? So basically, I guess the question is, will Israel accept any agreement that Trump will negotiate with Iran? Ilan and Marie or Haas, if you guys can take a stab on it.
My sense is it depends on the deal.
Okay.
It depends on the contents. If the contents involve, largely reducing Iran's, enrichment capacity, even a pathway that puts you on an eventual, world to zero enrichment and this international consortium. I think that is something the U.S. has a lot of leverage over if Donald Trump wants to use it with Netanyahu to say, you've accomplished your objectives, you can declare victory, like you can say zero enrichment, now stop. And if they get a strong, clear red light from the United States, and if that red light's also like, well, and we're not going to bomb Fordo, so good luck with that. Like, this is a better alternative. I mean, there's plenty of leverage for the U.S. to deploy, not to mention, I think, leverage in terms of like Israeli rearming and the capacity that the U.S. is providing there. I mean, I do think we'll never threaten or stop providing ballistic missile defense. Like that will just continue to happen no matter what. There are 700,000 Americans in Israel. And so like that's not really a point of leverage. I think that's just, part of the U.S.-Israel relationship as it should be. But I think there's plenty of leverage there. I wanted to just one other quick thing or two other quick things just while we're responding to that. One is I do think like on Hussein's point on the nuclear program, I don't know how long it takes Iran to reconstitute, because I don't think they have to reconstitute the entire thing. I mean, the program was built out pretty significantly, both for research purposes to be able to get the know-how to eventually build a nuclear weapon, and also for the political cover to claim they weren't. I mean, in a rebuild scenario, I think they're going to do the absolute minimum that they need to do to build a bomb, even like just an initial gun type device. And so, I think it can be done pretty quickly if they want to. And the case of Iraq is instructive. The Israelis did bomb Osirak in 1981, but also when the U.S. ended up invading, even in, after, during the first Gulf War, we found, and getting in afterwards, we found that Saddam's program had gone underground and was very close to a nuclear weapon, much closer than anyone had expected. So, again, these things have this kind of double-edged sword associated with them. And then I would like to say, if I want to just throw this out there while we're all talking, especially to Arash, who I think's talking to a lot of people in Iran, I'd very much be interested in his assessment of kind of these questions of regime change that keep popping up and what's possibly realistic, at some point before this conversation ends. So sorry, I'm not the moderator, but I just wanted to throw that out there because I think it's a really interesting question. I'm very interested in his take on it.
Totally fun. Arash, you want to address Ilan's question first?
Sure. On the question of regime change, right? Yes.
Yeah.
So, last night, Tasnim News Agency published the craziest little report, which said, it's so vague, it's like impossible to even try to translate it. But it basically says a group of people were preparing to offer a submission to the Zionist regime backed by a group of Qom ulama, so the Qom clerics, led, and they were gonna pretend like this was led by a former official of the regime. So we quashed the coup effort, right? That's basically what this is. The IRGC's news agency saying we quashed the coup effort. The former official, they say former top official. In my mind, this could be Hassan Rouhani. They very carefully didn't blame him. They said they were going to use him, right? But so I think, on different sort of forms of regime change scenarios that exist, I think the possibility of my perspective basically is that there's a possibility of a change inside the regime and of this sort of factions that are interested in, factions like Hassan Rouhani, who, Mari has knows well, I guess, amongst us. Their outlook on the world, I mean, I've known these guys, I talk to them, their outlook on the world is basically what I would say is like Western neoliberal. I mean, they're very interested in integration in the Western economy. They salivate at the thought of integration in the Western economy, actually. They're very sort of neoliberal, quote unquote, in that old like leftist slur way, as in they're like, they hate trade unions, they like good, efficient, economy. So, and as a result of this, they want to drop the anti-Western, anti-Israeli hostility. So I think possibility of these groups coming to power in Iran has always been quite a bit in the last few years. I always thought when Khamenei dies, there's a possibility that would happen. In fact, it's crazy that supporters of Khamenei's son, this gets lost a lot. People say, oh, Khamenei's son might come to power. This will be continuity. Now, I don't know what his son would actually want to do, but I can tell you one thing. The supporters of his son all sell him as the MBS. They use the word. They say he's going to be the MBS and he's going to represent this faction. So they don't sell him as the continuity candidate. They sell him as the opposite, that, we're going to need to do this shift. So I think on the longest story short of this is that I think under the pressure of the war, it is possible that a faction like this and could seize power in Iran. It could take different ways, from sidelining Khamenei to putting him under house arrest, but maybe it's not an actual house arrest. Maybe he's just sidelined and the power passes to others and they basically wait for him to die, as we all do, right? He's 86, right? So it can't be that far off in the future. So that's sort of what I think. There are other scenarios that are more sort of fantastic. I don't see social uprising at all, in the cards. It is possible. Of course, the one question we have to ask ourselves is that what happens if they actually go out and kill Khamenei, which I think is not impossible, right? If they kill Khamenei, my perspective is that what I just said is exactly what will happen, even if they kill Khamenei. If they kill Khamenei, this, Rouhani and them will actually immediately, a committee will take power according to constitution. I won't bore you with its composition, but it would be heavily pro-centrist. This, just the constitutional body that will take power, there wouldn't be a hardliner in there, basically. So, so this perspective that I said, I think will bear out. But anything, I have to just be clear, anything about, Reza Pahlavi, anything about, internationalization and stuff, I mean, I don't see that as at all likely. It's not impossible, some sort of internationalization, by which I mean, the regime really collapses somehow and you have like a committee of some foreign countries to come and say, oh, let's constitute a committee. And that committee, like Iraq in 2003, like you put Pahlavi, you put Narges Mohammadi, and you put some people from the regime. But I see all this stuff as very unlikely, although not impossible. I hope this was a coherent answer.
It is. Killing Khamenei. I've gone over this scenario multiple times over the last week. Another question from the audience, and I think it's important for us to address. Somebody asked, no one has really mentioned Russia or China in today's discussion. I was about to come to that. What's happening in the Middle East clearly has implications for these two great powers. What is likely to be their reactions to what's happening there? Is there a role that they can play, mediation role? Is Iran completely isolated if they don't play any role? Huss, do you want to take a stab at this?
I'm going to toss it to Marie, actually.
Oh.
I think she was going to weigh in, so if you
No, I'm happy for you to address this. Why don't you start with this, and then I'm happy to jump in.
I'll just say very quickly, I think it's very telling, the reactions out of Russia and China about the extent of their ties with the Islamic Republic. I mean, those of us who watched Iran very closely have been saying this for the last 10 years, that it is skin deep There's no strategic partnership that it, would commit Russia or China to defend a country that they, are not really that materially benefiting from. And they much rather see it be a place that, if there's any conflict around it, that it would weaken their adversaries. So you can bet they're watching the United States very closely to see the extent of involvement of the Trump administration in this. And I think part of the hesitation on the part of the Trump team is for that reason too, that if we go, then that will be to the delight of these two governments. So we shouldn't get bogged down, et cetera. And so I think the great powers are kind of sitting back and letting this kind of burn out. It's not dissimilar to the Iran-Iraq war's approach in that way, that assistance from the Soviet Union back then and the United States to both sides of the war was, it would come in waves and but really not materially significant, because both sides were interested in seeing Iran and Iraq weakened ultimately. So I think that's my read on their position in this particular period.
The one thing I would add just quickly is, if there is a real diplomatic process, Russia was exceedingly helpful getting the JCPOA both negotiated and implemented. They took a large majority of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile to Russia. So I think that, as much as the Europeans like to believe they're leading on this, if there will actually be something like Ilan said, I think that at least Russia, given their role in the nuclear deal the first time, should be involved and would be involved greatly. I will say one small, before we go to the next question, addition to one of the earlier comments I made about whether or not this will work with the nuclear program in terms of getting rid of the nuclear threat from Iran. We were very careful when we were negotiating the JCPOA to actually say this was not about changing the bilateral relationship in the long term, although I think President Obama deeply believed it could personally, but for political and very, real practical reasons didn't lean into that. In fact, we said the opposite. But listening to Arash talk about what a future leadership structure in Iran could be, one of the reasons, even if military strikes could destroy the nuclear capability very narrowly, one of the reasons I think diplomacy is probably still the best option is it provides a framework when there is a different leadership in Iran to have a different relationship. And that is to the benefit of the United States. It's not because we like being nice to people, but the fact that we could have, again, post Khomeini, like post Supreme Leader's death, like post whatever transition will happen, whether it's his son or someone else. I agree it's not the Pahlavis, but, someone else. I think that one of the reasons diplomacy is helpful is not just the narrow, goal of it, but to set a path for a different kind of relationship in the future, a more normalized relationship that, again, is in our interest. The fact that we can have an embassy in Moscow, but not in Tehran, to me, this is a controversial point, but is fairly crazy. And I think there are a lot of, again, post this supreme leader particularly, there is a potential different future for the US and Iran. And if you can do a deal that indicates what that future could look like, that is a good thing for regional security and for the United States. And by the way, for the Iranian people, many of whom are quite pro-Western and pro-US. Many more than in Saudi Arabia, for example.
Fully agree on that point. We've about 4.5, 5-ish minutes left, and I have a ton of questions that I don't think we have time to go over. But I do want to wrap it up with all that we've discussed today: Trump's deadline, erosion of international norms, regional tensions. What are the realistic pathways moving forward? One of the audience questions that I got was, is there a possibility of a ground invasion? I don't think we will see ground invasion in any scenario. That's that. But moving forward, what are the most likely scenarios in the next 2 weeks that we can see? Do we expect other Gulf states to play more of a role of a mediator between Iran and Israel? How do we move forward? What's the path forward? And that's a question to all of you. So
I'll just say something briefly, and then others can say. I mean, I will just say that on Russia, I think it relates to this. I think Russia could also play a mediating role between Iran and Israel in some ways. We forgot what a good relationship it has with Israel. Iran definitely doesn't want to forget because they want to forget sometimes because they want to valorize Putin as great, but at the same time has great relations with Israel. So I think it could be there. Look, I mean, I think it's the prediction of what's going to happen only. I mean, we do this in sort of consultancies and stuff. I'm not sort of much interested in doing here in that way. I can't separate myself as an Iranian from it as someone who wants good for the future of this region. But I do believe a diplomatic deal, in the next 2 weeks is possible. I think the Iranians that I talk to, a lot of them are, I mean, people in the power, very not very hopeful about it necessarily. Some are, but many are not. And so I think it's 50-50 if you sort of ask me to put a number on it. But I think it is possible, and I think it will be, as Mari gestured toward, I do think it will fundamentally be transformative it would lead to a transformative role in the relationship between Iran and the United States, because of this broader perspective that I have, which is that Khamenei, old revolutionary style, does not have a constituency anymore. It doesn't have constituency in the country. It doesn't really have it in the elites. They all want to be, nice, integrated into the Western economy. Nobody wants to lead the Islamist revolution anymore, really. I mean, that's my, sweeping sort of belief. And I think that's why I think a deal would pave the way toward that. And if I just say, let's not forget Arakchi. Arakchi called Trump a president of peace 2 months ago, and Pezeshkian openly said that the Supreme Leader had agreed for Iran to have extensive trade relations with the United States. So it's not just in my head.
Ilan?
Sure. Like, I think I kind of see maybe 3 broad scenarios. You can always expand to more. I mean, there's infinite scenarios, but at least for the immediate one is the one Arash is discussing, which maybe I'm less optimistic than 50-50, but it's certainly the one I'm personally advocating for and think is the best way to go. And so we should put our effort into leaving that option open for as long as possible and see if we can get there. The other 2 scenarios I see are one where the U.S. does decide to take out Fordo, or the Israelis have some kind of magic card up their hand and they can win. And basically you end up eventually with a military victory, something that looks a lot like the way the conflict with Hezbollah ended, where Iran kind of has to just accept peace on pretty terrible conditions because it doesn't have the options and it's been so degraded. I think that's certainly like a possible outcome. That's maybe the second best outcome. Because I think even in that scenario, we still have a lot of long-term problems and none of the opportunities Arash was discussing and Marie was discussing. And the third scenario is the U.S. takes out Fordo, and it was pretty significant Iranian retaliation. You can't Iran's got the capacity to last a lot longer. The hardliners hold out in the regime. It's not the folks that Arash is talking about who are ultimately influencing the decisions. In which case, this could just drag. I mean, this is one thing we learned about wars. Don't underestimate how long this can drag. Gaza's going 20 months later. Ukraine's going 3 years later. We could just be in this for a very long time at some level of violence, which I think it's the worst outcome for certainly Iranian and Israeli civilians, but also for Iran and Israel and the United States and everybody else. Right now, that still feels like the most likely outcome, unfortunately, because, it's a lot easier to start wars than it is to end them.
Marie, quick 30 seconds.
I will be very quick, and then Huss can land this plane for us. There's an interesting piece of reporting from Trump's first term when he had ordered a series of strikes on Iran that he liked ordering them, but it felt decisive to pull back and cancel them. This is a little remembered part of the first Trump term when he had thought about striking Iran. And his advisor said he liked the decisiveness of being able to pull back bombers even once they were in the air. I think the most likely scenario is actually what Ilan said earlier, that we get some kind of diplomatic agreement. The Israelis can say they had a military success. They set the stage for this. They can claim victory, and Trump gets some kind of agreement. I don't know if it'll take more than 2 weeks. And then we're sort of back to where we were before with a significantly weakened Iran. But not American bombers attacking Fordo. I do not think that's the most likely scenario. I could be wrong, but that's where I think this is headed, and we will see. But I think Trump does not want to actually do it.
Yeah, I agree on that.
Only to say, I really hope Maria is right and I am wrong.
I do too. I do too. I think I'm more pessimistic than most here, in that I see, going back to my first answer, this war was started based on a security dilemma acted on by Benjamin Netanyahu in this way. I'm afraid the only way it'll come to an end, it's a decision is in his hands. I don't see them walking away from this campaign without any significant material gain. They do not want this to go down as something that they just barely scratched a couple of nuclear sites and did not really hurt Fordo. That would be a big loss for Netanyahu. And so I worry that he is a lot more invested in continuing this and escalating because of the national security objectives that he's communicated. I'm not, talking about some sort of like conspiratorial mindset here that he wants to, war and misery to go on. I think he genuinely thinks that we're in this to really hurt Iran's capabilities, and we're not going to get out until those capabilities are hurt. And if the U.S. is not going to get involved, maybe we'll start doing things to get the U.S. involved. So I think there's a lot more left in this. But obviously, the diplomatic pathways that Arash and Marie have laid out would be the exit ramp that I think we should all hope for.
I think, going to your point, Netanyahu also hoped that Trump would join right away in this conflict. And Trump's done the opposite. He's now he's gone back and forth. He's put in a 2-week pause on all of this, which is not what Netanyahu hoped for. Anyhow, we're 3 minutes above time. I, can continue a conversation on this for the next hour. I want to thank our distinguished panelists, with President Trump's decision looming, voices from inside Iran pleading for an end to the violence. The coming days are going to be critical for all of us to see where this conflict goes. But I want to thank all of you guys for joining us today, and I want to thank Perry Wildhouse for holding this panel. Thank you.